Thank you very much for this exciting presentation of how FERN started, how we started. And I believe everybody on this call was there when FERN started. And it's a good thing that we are continuing this journey, FERN with you. And you've seen the result of the interaction through the work that Prof presented in Ghana, but also in the sub-region. If you like this presentation, I can guarantee you that what would follow would be more exciting, because what will follow would be a discussion of policy innovations in Africa. So what is it that, and we're covering pretty much a good portion of Africa, north, east, south, and west. So we have very high profile people who would join the panel and will be telling us how they've used policy innovation to improve the food environment where they live and even beyond where they live. So with that, I would like to invite the chair of the session, Penman Milani. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Silver, Amos, colleagues. It's a pleasure and honor to moderate this first session, this first panel. We're in for a treat here, both in terms of the topic as well as the constellation of contributors that we have to the panel, representing perspectives from South Africa, Kenya, Ghana, Egypt, and Morocco, and in topics such as sugary beverage taxation, labeling regulations, nutrient profiling models, food-based dietary guidelines, and especially with this angle of innovation. I mean, there's a lot of innovation happening in our continent. It's exciting, and this forum, among others, is great for that exchange of experiences, lessons learned, and how do we move forward together. So in terms of the structure of the panel, we'll invite each one of the speakers to do a very brief 1-minute introduction in which I'll ask them to not only mention their affiliation, but which kind of effort they'll be showcasing, just like as a teaser, as a mouth-watering preview for the presentation. Then what we'll do is that we'll just launch a set of questions that will guide the presentation of each one of the panelists. Each panelist will have about 5 minutes in that first round of responses. Then we'll come up with a second round of questions. And again, each panelist will address them, this time in 3 minutes. Then we'll open up for Q&A from all participants, and then wrap it up around 2 p.m. Ghana time. So with that, let me invite our first speaker, Dr. Samira Mahomedy from Priceless, South Africa, to introduce her and again give us a very brief teaser of her presentation. Samira, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for having me. My name is Samira Mahomedy, and I am at the University of Witwatersrand at the Research Unit Priceless SA in South Africa. And I'm part of the Law and Policy team here. And just very briefly, in terms of my work, I look at various aspects of the food environment, including things like front of pack label, marketing restrictions, industry interference, and more broadly, commercial determinants of health. But I think most of my discussion will probably be around the SSB tax in South Africa. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Samira. Next, we have Professor Rina Swart from the University of Western Cape in South Africa. Rina, please.
Thank you very much. I'm Rina Swart. I'm dietitian by training, but public health nutritionist for most of my life. And I'm from the University of the Western Cape, and we'll be speaking about the draft regulation on food labeling in South Africa. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. Let's move on then to Gershom Asiki from the APHRC in Kenya. Gershom, the floor is yours for a quick introduction, please.
Thank you, Payman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gershom Asiki, a research scientist at African Population and Health Research Center. I lead the Chronic Disease Management Unit at the center. My research on food environment is a policy bundle double duty intervention project where we're developing and implementing 4 policies together with the Ministry of Health and evaluating the impact of this on healthy food consumption and NCD prevention. The 4 policies we're looking at is front of pack labeling, restriction of marketing of foods to children, unhealthy foods to children. We're also looking at healthy food procurement in public institutions and fiscal policies to encourage healthy food consumption. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks a lot, Gershom. Next, we have the esteemed Professor Richmond Ariti from the University of Ghana. Richmond, your introduction, please.
My name is Richmond Ariti. I am head of Population, Family and Reproductive Health Department. And I am a public health nutritionist focusing on food systems. And this afternoon, I'm going to talk to you about food-based dietary guidelines.
Next, we have Habiba Hassan Wassef from ASRT, who will share with us the Egypt experience. Habiba, would you kindly introduce yourself?
Okay. Now, I am chair of the National Nutrition Sciences Committee, but I am at the level of a senior expert, and so a member of several nutrition and food and policy-related committees in Africa and at home. And I have done a lot of research, but currently I am sort of advising on what directions to take. So the problems and challenges in Egypt are immense. And I would like to talk about what we're doing about it with our 110 million, a population of 110 million, a poverty rate of about 30% or over 30%. And we are a gravely food deficit country. We import most of what we eat. So the challenges are great. And I would like to share some of what we're doing. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Habiba. And last but not least, we have Ali Jaffrey from UM6SS from Morocco. Ali, could you please introduce yourself?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm Ali Jaffrey. I am a professor of physiology and nutrition at the Mohammed VI University of Sciences and Health in Morocco, Casablanca. I'm also the director of the PhD program at the university. In my talk, I'll be talking about the experience of Morocco in reducing salt intake. Thank you.
Very interesting. Thank you, Ali. Great. So we have full house in terms of our distinguished panelists here. So let me just throw to the panel this first set of 3 questions, which I would ask you that even as you do your presentation, please try to address these questions as much as possible. The first question is, what are some pressing challenges in the African food environment or food systems today? And how do these challenges represent opportunities for policy innovations to address them, the things that you have been working on? Second is, in what ways can policy innovations support the promotion of healthy, affordable, and culturally appropriate diets across Africa? And question 3 is, can you share examples of policy innovation employed to reduce access to and consumption of unhealthy food on the African continent? And I'm sure that several of the policy innovations to be discussed here will speak directly to that. So with that, we'll ask for each one of the panelists to speak for 5 minutes in doing their initial presentation and comments on these questions before we move on to the second round of questions. So we'll start with Samira from Priceless. Samira, the floor is yours for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think just to touch on your first question in terms of the pressing challenges, which I think we share across various countries in Africa, a big thing that we've seen is what we've called the nutrition transition, which is basically dietary shifts from healthier to more unhealthy foods and products, specifically in the developing world. And why we're also seeing this is because a lot of these multinational, transnational corporations have actually identified Africa and African countries as their growth market because they've already saturated the markets in their own home countries. And so that's obviously a big concern kind of across the board. And I think more broadly, so obviously we have the issue with these increasing harmful products being introduced into the diets and introduced into our homes. But apart from the products, it's also the practices that we're concerned about as well. So it's not just these unhealthy products that they're selling us, but it's the way they're going about doing it. And a lot of the work that we look at now is on what we call commercial determinants of health, which is increasingly an area that we've focused on. And basically, as a very brief definition, it's the systems, practices, the pathways through which commercial actors drive health and equity. And so it's basically the way in which private sector activities affect the population. And I must note that this can be either positively or negatively, but we are increasingly seeing more negative kind of impacts. And where they are positive, a lot of the times it is more under the guise of what is traditionally seen as corporate social responsibility, but there are obviously often motives behind it. And so I think broadly speaking, this is something that we really need to tackle, the two issues that I mentioned in terms of the increase of unhealthy products, but also the tactics and the techniques that are used to kind of build the support and this brand loyalty that gets people to buy these unhealthy products. Then in terms of policy innovation, of course, given the far-reaching impacts of commercial determinants of health, as I mentioned, I think policy innovations are key to creating and promoting healthy food environments, especially given how intentional these producers of unhealthy food products are in infiltrating markets and countries. And so regulation is crucial in this regard. And obviously from the South African perspective, I think one of the big kind of innovations that we've seen as a policy win is the sugar sweetened beverage tax with the health promotion levy that was introduced in 2018 in South Africa. And it's basically based on sugar content as a public health measure to reduce obesity in South Africa. And I think this is a very good example of policy innovation, definitely a move in the right direction. However, there have been some issues, unfortunately, in terms of the implementation thereof, but I don't think that should take away from this as a policy win, just because of the amount of time, energy, and effort that went into kind of really getting it passed. But to link back to kind of a little bit of the commercial determinants of health sector, we saw a lot of industry interference even as we were getting the levy passed. So we saw that industries kind of banded together and really focused on key kind of messaging in which they tried to delay the process of getting the tax implemented. And also ultimately the initial suggestion was for a 20% tax. And I think what we ended up introducing is just under 11%, which is obviously quite a vast difference in terms of the efficacy. And that was vastly due to industry interference in that regard. So during the public participation processes, we saw kind of a lot of messaging and arguments, for example, the impact on the economy and how it will affect vulnerable populations. Also, this idea of promotion of self-regulation and voluntary actions was also something that we saw quite a bit of. And so I think it's valuable in itself to really understand the tactics that industry are using when they are trying to curb these policy innovations and delay them. Because I think we saw similar things with, for example, the front of pack labeling in our Latin American countries as well. So we're introducing that or trying to introduce that at the moment. And a lot of the similar arguments are being used in that regard. And so it's helpful to also study kind of the playbooks that are used by these industries, because they're often very much the same, and try to target that. I think perhaps I'll leave it at that for now. I'm not sure how much time I have left, but
you have a minute if you'd like to wrap up.
Okay, sure. So yeah, so basically I think the SSB tax in terms of policy innovation was a big win. Like I said, we are in the process of trying to get the front of pack label and the marketing restrictions linked to that in place. But again, we're seeing very similar arguments being used by industry. And I think it's really worthwhile commissioning research into looking at this, not just, for our country specifically, but across the board, because we're seeing this globally happening. Thank you.
Thank you, Samira. Great comments. I think from Gershom, we'll also hear a little bit about the tensions when the industry tries to hijack the processes around these policies. But let's move on to Rina Schwartz then. Rina, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, I'm going to speak about the policy innovation of front of pack labeling in South Africa. And I am talking about the front of pack labeling efforts, understanding quite well that it's at the moment in a draft regulation form, and that we do not know yet exactly what the outcome of that would be. But it was quite a journey, and I think it's worthwhile to share with colleagues and other people in the field who may want to consider that as an area of development for themselves. So maybe just a brief history in South Africa around the front of pack labeling. So our latest review of the labeling regulation in South Africa took place in 2010, and that's R146, and already introduced at that time the most up-to-date codex kind of regulations in the labeling regulation. So remember, labeling regulation in South Africa deals with all aspects of labeling regulation. So that's from the list of ingredients that need to appear on the front of the pack, on the back of the pack, as well as if there are claims. So that was regulated in 146. Then there was work commissioned and an intention to change the labeling regulation and implement or incorporate front of pack labeling into that regulation, as well as marketing to children. That was published, a draft regulation, in 2014, R429, and met with massive, and I have to repeat, massive industry opposition. So much so that it was actually withdrawn by government with the intention to rework it. The major argument used in 2014 was that there is no evidence, no research, specifically South African research, to support a front of pack label. At that stage, the draft regulation proposed a voluntary front of pack label. It was based on a multiple traffic light using the Fazan's nutrient profiling model. And there was a kind of an annexure to guide regulation of marketing to children. Interestingly enough, I have to admit that in that period post the publication of the draft regulation, for the next 2 years, more or less, the cartoons, a lot of the child-directed marketing that used to appear on the packages disappeared from the market. There were significant changes to paypoint marketing in the supermarkets, but then as time went by, all of these things returned to the market. We then did commissioned work to provide evidence for the Department of Health on whether a front of pack label could work in South Africa and what the perceptions of the population would be, and they specifically requested that we explore the performance of a warning label. It took us quite a while. So we worked on this work between 2018 and 2022. So that is one comment that I have to make, that if you do want to provide adequate research to support your recommendation, it is not something that happens overnight, because regulations needs to be in place, different aspects need to be researched. We developed a nutrient profiling model. We tested that profiling model on the food supply, indicating that South Africa, about 76% of our packaged food supply is actually ultra-processed or contains nutrients of concern. We then did a randomized controlled trial, and eventually in 2023, 21st April 2023, they published the draft regulation on labeling. That's a revamp of the total labeling regulation, from ingredients list to sell-by dates, product names, and so on. And it's quite innovative because it is proposing a mandatory front of pack label, which will be a warning label, and which would be the first in Africa if it is approved. But as I said, That's out for public comments. We are again seeing the same kind of opposition to the proposal by the Department of Health, and we're awaiting their summary of the comments and the regulatory processes within the department before we will see what the final regulation will look like. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Rina. Let's move on to Kenya now with Gershom Asiki from APHRC, who will share their experiences with the Kenya Food Environment policies.
Thank you. I'm going to base my contribution on the Food Environment Policy Action Project, which is funded by Rockefeller Foundation and IDRC.
Sorry, Gershom, are you able to turn on your video by any chance?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
There? Yeah. So, based on our research, engaging stakeholders in Kenya, the major challenges that we have experienced, and also from the views of the stakeholders, are: one, we are experiencing a double burden of malnutrition. It's not a perfect transition in Africa. It's more of an addition to a challenge. We have undernutrition coexisting with overnutrition, yet the available policies tend to focus on undernutrition. So when we want to develop policies, we need to look at double duty action policies in order to address the problem of NCDs and undernutrition in Africa. Then the second challenge is low levels of nutrition literacy at the population level. These policies cannot succeed if the levels of literacy are quite low. So they need to engage the public and educate them on nutrition issues. Then there's a huge focus on the narratives of individual responsibility other than regulatory and fiscal government policies. So a lot of studies have been conducted on individual risk factors, and there's a lot of health promotion going on healthy eating, but less of regulatory policies. Yet there's evidence that shows that these individual level factors, addressing them without looking at the macro environment, does not actually achieve much success. And then we have prioritization of commercial interests over public health priorities. Most governments in Africa are promoting industrialization, and the food industry is one of the industries receiving a lot of subsidies, tax exemptions to allow them to invest in the country, to offer employment opportunities. So there are a lot of commercial interests emerging, which tend to mask the public health priorities. The fifth challenge is that many policies in Africa prioritize treatment of NCDs other than prevention. And so when you talk about unhealthy food as a risk factor for NCDs, it does not receive priority. Our desk reviews of policies in 5 African countries clearly showed that nutrition policies were the weakest compared to the other 3 NCD risk factors. Finally, there's lack of local evidence. In Kenya, there was an attempt to introduce SSP taxation twice, in 2018 and 2021. This was thrown out of parliament because there was lack of evidence, clear evidence, the link between the taxation and healthy food consumption. So as researchers, we are really trying to generate more evidence, local evidence, and also using evidence from other countries to try and persuade policymakers and the politicians to really understand the relationship between these policies and NCDs. Coming to the second question, how these challenges represent opportunities. One, we have an opportunity of food insecurity policies that are very strong, so we can anchor policies and come up with double duty action policies based on existing policies. So there's an environment of existing policies, but for undernutrition that we can anchor new policies on. Public engagement is another one. There's an opportunity to engage. We have several stakeholders that we have empowered, advocacy partners who are working towards introducing the idea of regulatory policies. And then multi-sectoral action. You cannot succeed in introducing food policy environment policies without involving multiple government sectors, agriculture, trade, and so forth. So we're working together with multiple stakeholders to work on policies to improve the food environment. What policy innovations are we introducing? As I mentioned earlier, we are introducing a double duty policy bundle that is looking at a combination of 4 policies. There's evidence from a recent literature review published in 2017, which showed that implementing policies in combination results into better effects on reduction of unhealthy food consumption. So we are using this approach to implement 4 policies together, which I mentioned before. But before implementing or developing those policies, we embarked on developing a nutrient profile model for Kenya. And that is important because for the policies to be culturally acceptable for appropriate diets, you need to develop a nutrient profile nutrient profile model, which looks at local foods available and developing thresholds that will inform the policies in the countries. I think this is applicable to many countries in Africa as well. So in our food environment policy action project, what we have embarked on is first to develop the nutrient profile model, which is now in a draft form. However, this did not come without challenges. There was an attempt by the food industry to influence the thresholds for the nutrient profile model in that we are developing for Kenya. However, I'm happy to report that through advocacy and through collaborative work with the Ministry of Health, Kenya Bureau of Standards, we have come up with the right thresholds of the Kenya nutrient profile model. And we have also formed committees, multi-sectoral committees, 4 different policy committees that are developing the 4 policies that I mentioned before. And we have already drafted a front of pack labeling standard. We are now testing this with the populations in Kenya. We have done qualitative interviews, focus group discussions in 12 groups across the country. We are very soon doing a randomized control trial to test 3 different samples, and then we will come up with a sample for Kenya. So in a nutshell, what I want to say is, although there are multiple challenges, working as multiple stakeholders, researchers, advocacy partners, together with the Ministry of Health and other government sectors, can actually lead to success. So our innovation really is looking at a multi-sectoral action and a policy bundle encompassing several policies, implementing this to achieve a greater action. So we're hoping that in the next 1 year or so, we will be implementing some of these policies and measuring the impact. Perhaps one thing that I want to conclude with is that having the policies as a bundle helps us to address the issue of inequalities, looking at vulnerable communities. For instance, when you're looking at a fiscal policy should include, apart from taxation of unhealthy foods, tax exemptions from healthy foods, and also subsidies to healthier food options to make options of foods available to populations that are actually struggling with food security issues. So, and then when you also,
Thank you. Yeah, and you'll have the opportunity to further add in the second round of questions. But thank you. Very, very interesting presentation of the good progress in Kenya. With that, we'll move over to Ghana with Richmond. He'll share with us on the food-based dietary guidelines and HD4HL efforts there. Richmond, please.
All right. Thank you very much. So we have, in this year, launched our food-based dietary guidelines in Ghana. And I can count on my fingers the number of countries in Africa that have developed food-based dietary guidelines. The question is, why is food-based dietary guidelines important? Because we know that there is all kinds of misinformation about what people should eat. There are people who do not know how even diseases and poor lifestyles occur, and the role of their diets, how it influences those outcomes. So we have developed this so that it will be a tool that individuals can use to guide their dietary choices. Food-based dietary guidelines also helps governments to be able to make decisions regarding many aspects of food-related policy. For example, school feeding needs some guidance regarding what foods should be provided to children in schools. There are also government programs like social protection programs. In Ghana, we have a program where the government gives cash to ultra poor segments of the population. And this could also be guided by the food-based dietary guidelines. The reason why a lot of countries haven't done this is because there is not a lot of evidence around or the evidence that is needed to do it at country level. But there is also not adequate competence to be able to do it. We are thankful that we had support from FAO to be able to do that. And I'd like to take a little bit of time to talk about the process that we use for developing the food-based dietary guidelines. What we did was to start by putting together a technical committee that comprised representatives from various government sectors, especially those that we anticipated will be involved in the of the food-based dietary guidelines. And so it included health sector, education, the regulatory agencies, and also those who are involved in social protection, and then also agriculture because of the food production. And then we commissioned, the technical group commissioned a series of evidence synthesis on what is the diseases that people are facing within the country, in urban areas, in rural areas, which foods are commonly consumed, and which diet-related outcomes are commonly observed. We also looked at lifestyles, dietary practices, food insecurity, food access, and issues around the food environment. So access to food, where is food available, where people can procure it. And we put all of this together to be able to then prioritize which are the key messages that we should focus on, which conditions or which health and nutrition issues we should prioritize. Eventually, we came up with about 4 or 5 key issues. One, that Ghanaians are moving rapidly towards overweight and obesity, and therefore the recommendations should enable them to be able to make healthier choices. We also focused on issues around non-communicable diseases. So not just overweight and obesity, but also other non-communicable diseases. We know that the population is still young, so we prioritized young people, but we didn't prioritize children. We decided that we would develop different recommendations for young children 5 years and below. And the evidence synthesis and diet modeling that we did enabled us to come up with 6 recommendations. These 6 recommendations are the primary recommendations of the food-based dietary guidelines. One, talking about dietary diversity. Then we promoted a message on eating fruits, another message on eating vegetables. And for all of these, we promoted eating a variety of them. We had a message on limiting intake of unhealthy fats, and then also promoting the consumption of a variety of staple foods. Our studies showed us that most people are transitioning away from eating the traditional foods and tubers and now eating a lot more rice, especially polished rice. And so we wanted to promote the idea of eating a variety of staple foods, and then also ensuring that people are consuming a lot more legumes and pulses and nuts. We also had complementary recommendations, again, based on the findings that we're seeing, that especially in urban areas, there's increasing consumption of fried foods and sugar-sweetened beverages. So we recommended reducing consumption of these, especially foods that are high in sugar, salt, and fat. And then we also recommended the reading and use of food labels, and then also promoting an active lifestyle, drinking water instead of sugar-sweetened beverages, and then also keeping food safe. So these are the recommendations that then came out of that. We are currently in a phase of implementation because unfortunately, our findings again show that most food-based dietary guidelines, once they are made or they are developed, there's not much effort in implementing and promoting it, the recommendations. So we've developed an implementation plan, and we are working with various partners to be able to implement it so that it doesn't just become a document. So in a nutshell, this is what we have done in Ghana related to food-based dietary guidelines. I must say that one of the things that we have also been able to do is that learning from the lessons in developing ours, we've been able to extend the capacity that we have got to the Gambia. And just this week I received...
Richmond,
yes.
Sorry to interrupt. We're quite a bit past of the time allotted, but the next round of questions is exactly about leveraging lessons learned. So if I could ask you to save that thought and then share in the next round. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Excellent. Great work. I'm going to ask the next two speakers to please try their best to stick to the 5 minutes allocated, so we leave time towards the end for Q&A and discussion. So let's move on to Habiba. Habiba, please, floor is yours.
Thank you. For Egypt, the challenges are absolutely enormous because we start by being a food deficit country. And now we have become a water deficit country. We have a very high level of water scarcity, and the total amount of water per head, per person in Egypt has reached nearly half of the recommended requirements. So what are we doing? First of all, food and nutrition security is a priority in the National Sustainable Development Plan for 2030. But the most important challenges are the rapid and progressive increase in population with very limited cultivated land area. Egypt originally was around the Delta and the Nile Valley, and all the rest was desert. So what are we doing at the moment? In the national plans, we have several and multiple approaches to tackle food and nutrition security. The first is protection of land from degradation and increase the quality of the soil. The delta, which is what is called the old land and very fertile, is now being invaded by the sea, and the north of the delta is becoming salinated and very poorly quality of soil, because the annual flood water is no more cleaning and washing away or keeping the sea from invading the delta. So the quality of the land is very important, and there is a lot of research and a lot of innovative approaches to improve the quality of the land, especially using nature-based solutions. Now, to increase the area of cultivated land, the original was about 4.5 million, what we call fiddans, which is about 2/3 of the hectare, has now been increased to over 6 million, with a new project that is under preparation for what we call a new delta, taking a canal from the Nile to the west of the actual delta, and bonification or reclaiming the desert on each side of the Nile Valley. So this was already done, and it's continuous, and we are doing a great work in this area. Protection of or preservation of the water, we are cementing canals, the major canals, because we have an irrigation system. We are cementing the canals so as to reduce the loss of water. There are many other strategies for increasing the yield. So intensified agriculture, what we call the vertical increase in the yield of products, has done wonders. We've doubled the yield in several of the cultivated commodities. But what is more important is it is not only production and availability. The list is very long, and I will stop here, but accessibility. So with over 30% of the population under the poverty line, actually it's 32.5, we have a food subsidy program that started in the 1970s and is continuing, but we are evaluating and improving it and adding to it as we go along, because the demand has increased. We have a social protection system that covers the families most in need, and a very active food bank that works with the social protection, with the social services, and both have a program that does not only provide money, cash transfers or food handouts, but the families who receive these donations or food handouts join a training program for professionals, so that we have a program for getting poor families out of poverty at the same time that we give them the food subsidy or the cash transfers. Another very important thing is that we have a system that covers the whole country with cooperatives or food cooperatives that have access to the general public of price-controlled commodities of high quality. This bypasses the really ridiculous increase and spiking of prices in uncontrolled markets that has taken very shocking proportions after especially the COVID-19 epidemic, and the food crisis after the Ukraine war. I will maybe talk about the difficulty to change or to advocate for healthy food habits. Unfortunately, all the researches on the high level of stunting encountered in children incriminates junk food and the snacking habit of the young people. And the snacking habit goes across all social strata in Egypt. It is a real menace. So we have tried to control, and I'll tell you a curious response that we had in our committee when we wanted to advise the authorities to control the production of the high salt, high fat potato chips. What happened is that the farmer, because we have a very high quantity production of potato chips in the country, that the farmer has now turned to cultivating potatoes, and the social study of the farmer's income showed that he lives on the cost or what he gains from selling potatoes to the potato chip companies. So it's not easy to just say, I can change the habit or stop the habit. It goes back to the life or the livelihood of the farmer who is selling those potatoes. The other thing is we also failed in controlling sugar, and there are initiatives controlling sugar content, taxation on sugar, taxation on salt. We did not succeed. So these are the really major challenges that we still have. Thank you.
Thank you, Habiba. It's a very worthy fight. It just reminds us of all the challenges involved, especially in this context of polycrisis that we face. So let's hear now from Ali Jafri from UM6SS. Ali, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think almost everything has been said regarding the challenges that we face, and I think when we talk about healthy diets, the challenges are almost the same. Maybe there's no.
Yes, please proceed. We can hear you.
Thank you. So maybe there is a controversy or a debate on what constitutes a healthy diet. When it comes to salt reduction, I think almost everyone agrees the challenges that we face or that we faced in Morocco, maybe in other countries that attempted before us to reduce salt, sugar, and fats is their use in the food industry. And as you know, salt is a main ingredient in food industry for its taste, for the role that it plays in processing. And the other thing, it is very cheap. In most countries, salt, sodium chloride is very cheap. It's really available, and there is a lack of alternatives. So when you want to present or when you talk about to food industry about reducing salt, they have their own processing concerns. They are valid concerns because when you use salt as a main ingredient in your processing and you ask this usual to reduce the use of this main ingredient, that could affect the taste, the texture, maybe the shelf life of the product. Now, putting this aside, when we talk about reducing salt, one of the lecture talks about nutrition transition. Now we're transitioning into a setting where it's easier to do the wrong choice or to choose the unhealthy diets. Why? Because it's readily available. It's almost, it's not even about cost. Some people talk about taxation and more regulation. As Dr. Habiba said, it has been done. Sometimes it doesn't work. The example of sugar taxation, because nowadays, especially when we talk about the younger population, they have been accustomed, they have been used to a certain lifestyle, to certain dietary habits, and we should challenge, we should address those habits at their root. So now, when we talk about opportunity, where we can go from there, there's a lot of opportunity, and policy can come after. So because if we start by policy, and this is what has been proven again and again in food fortification and the programs to reduce salt and sugar, sometimes a lot of people, a lot of stakeholders don't adhere. So now what we can do, we can federate the efforts. When we talk to industry, we're not opponents, but we are on the same page. We are trying to offer healthy alternatives. So first of all, to raise awareness, to institutionalize nutrition education in schools and higher education, and there are experiences all around the world that have that when we when we invest in nutrition education at an early age, it can be successful. Professor Richmond talked about nutrition guidelines. Now, as he said, a lot of African countries don't have guidelines to healthy nutrition, don't have food permits or what have you. Maybe an effort should be put on that to underscore or to promote healthy diets. But not only that, the food systems should go along with these efforts. You can't put guidelines and parallel to these guidelines, there are not the infrastructure doesn't allow citizens to buy or to acquire these kind of foods. And I think these things that we are aware of those as nutrition professionals, but a lot of effort should be put in them into a good example. I think a lot of people talked about this for me labeling that has been proven to be of great help in the ability of consumers to choose good diets. Now, for Morocco, for example, food labeling has become mandatory. And not only that, on the packaging, it doesn't have to be only in one language, but in French and in Arabic, also on important products. And this is a huge step in the right direction, not only for salt reduction, but when we start from raising awareness and the consumers are aware of what they're consuming, maybe the policy will come after, and other measures in enforcing the policy should be also put aside, not put aside, but should contribute to enforce these steps. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ali. Great points. We'll now move to the second round of questions, and these questions really have to do with lessons learned and inclusivity and equity. So the first question is, what lessons can be learned from successful and failed policy innovations in other regions that can be adapted to the unique context of Africa? And we know that often failure is a better teacher than success. And the second is, what strategies can be implemented to ensure that these food policies, including the innovations we're discussing here, are inclusive and leave no one behind, particularly vulnerable and marginalized populations. And a good example are things that, let's say, touch packaged foods, when we know that so much of the food that we consume in the continent is not packaged. So with that, we'll go around through our speakers again. So let's start with Samira, and I'll ask each speaker to operate more in a rapid fire mode this time, keeping your comments to 3 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A from the whole group. Samira, please.
Great, thank you. I will try my best to summarize. So in terms of lessons learned, I think generally, and it's come across, I think, in all the presentation, but basically just how the processes work and the length of these processes in terms of getting things kind of from inception stage into the policy sphere can take a really long time. And I think Prof. Swart alluded to this very well in terms of the front of pack labeling in South Africa. So I think in this regard, we can learn from countries, not just in Africa, but across the board. So Latin America has been pioneering, for example, front of pack. And here we can look at kind of the issues that were faced, for example, in relation to industry challenges. And we can use this to preempt arguments that will probably be used in our context as well, and to counter them in advance to hopefully also assist with the delays. And also we can focus on the type of research and evidence that is needed and that has been requested in other companies, again, once again, to just kind of limit the delays that industry often tries to kind of put into play. And then in terms of the strategies to ensure inclusivity, I think here, obviously, public participation is a really important step. So public participation process throughout kind of the policy process is crucial. But I think also in terms of our research as well, it's really important to consider different research methodologies that are actually inclusive. I think oftentimes we sit kind of a bit far removed from lived reality. So I think it was touched on now by our chair in terms of the fact that often we're focusing on packaged foods, but a large amount of the food that is consumed isn't actually as formalized and packaged and regulated in that way. And so, for example, we have a study that we focused on marketing to school children, and in particular girl children, because of the kind of gender dynamic when it comes to NCD burdens, but also when it comes to marketing often. And we used what is called the photo voice methodology. So basically we got school girls from various income areas in South Africa to map their journey from their house to their school and back. And basically we gave them little cameras and they were to document the type of marketing that they came across or that they were exposed to, and also to share what actually appealed to them. And we also spoke to their parents or to various parents through focus group discussions. And the preliminary results are very interesting in terms of what children actually perceive to be healthy versus unhealthy food. So for example, one of the children had mentioned that for them, cake is actually healthy because it's got egg and milk in it, but icing is the unhealthy part. So that's where the sugar comes in. And so just to understand kind of how different marketing appeals to them, it's been extremely helpful. And then obviously the idea is that we would kind of take the findings and feed them into what our policy asks would be and how to regulate marketing in this particular instance. But basically the point is that the type of methodologies that we use are very important to get an understanding of the perceptions, but also the lived realities and what actually needs to be regulated and what steps need to be taken, and also to ensure that there's actual buy-in from those affected. So we're not just kind of imposing policies top down onto populations. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Samira. Great point on inclusive methodologies, not just in research, but also in planning and design. Rina, your thoughts, please. Rina, are you still with us? Okay, then let me move on to Gershom, and hopefully we'll still hear from Rina again. Gershom, do you want to go?
Yeah, so the lessons learned from other parts of the world, particularly Latin America. Also within Africa, we have countries like South Africa that are ahead with the implementation of these policies. Together with Ghana, we have done a number of studies together. So based on systematic reviews or desk reviews, we have learned a lot that there's a lot of industry opposition. So we have to be prepared when we are developing and implementing these policies. And most of the opposition is a lot about the evidence. So we need to be prepared with local evidence that we have to generate based on empirical studies and desk reviews and examples from other countries. The second learning point is the policy formulations. In order to address all groups, including vulnerable groups, the formulations of the policy should be informed by local research. For instance, if we know the nutrition rates, malnutrition rates, undernutrition, overnutrition in specific populations, then we will be able to adapt our policies to address those peculiar needs. One case in point is the relationship between undernutrition and NCDs. Unlike in the developed world where the pathway is through obesity, there's clear evidence, in fact, even from the developed world, that undernutrition can lead to NCDs. So we need to generate such evidence because our governments tend to understand undernutrition as a problem more than overnutrition. And therefore, if we bring in the link between undernutrition and NCDs and these policies, then it will lead to success in our policy advocacies. Another aspect that we have learned is the use of nutrient profile models that are adapted to the countries, but using a regional nutrient profile model. For instance, we have the WHO Afro nutrient profile model, which helped us a lot in informing how the nutrient profile model for Kenya is developed. And these learnings came from also Latin America, where WHO has regional nutrient profile models, which were later adopted to inform their policies in the specific countries. Another important thing is voluntary standards versus mandatory. We already have had discussions on whether our front of pack labels should be mandatory or voluntary. The technical committee was already proposing a front of pack label that should be voluntary. The implementation should be voluntary. But evidence from other countries has already shown that voluntary implementation has very low compliance by the industry. So we're already using this evidence to advocate for going for a mandatory label other than a voluntary front or pack label. If I have time, I'll just touch on a little bit on the strategies to implement policies to ensure equitable implementation and impact.
In 30 seconds, if possible, Gershon, please, go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing we have done is to do modeling studies, system dynamic modeling, to try and look at the impact of various policy formulations in different populations. We know that we're not yet implementing the policies, but modeling studies can actually help a lot to inform how policies reach specific populations. And as I mentioned earlier, involvement of multiple stakeholders, engagement of various groups, consumer groups, will enable us to understand better what the peculiar needs of different populations are, and therefore we tailor our policies to meet those needs. Finally, once the policies are being implemented, it's important to continue conducting impact studies, to look at the penetration of the policies in various groups, to understand the impact on consumption of healthy foods or a reduction of consumption of unhealthy foods in different populations. So we in Kenya are planning to implement such studies, time series studies. From the time policies are being implemented, we want to design studies that will track the implementation, the uptake, and the impact in different populations. That can inform actually the formulation of the policies to address different population needs. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Gershon. Lots of great nuggets from Gershon, including the importance of local evidence, context, and mandatory rather than voluntary policies. Let's see if we can get Rina online now. Rina, can you hear us?
Yes, I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, please go ahead.
So I'll try to be very brief. I think the one critical thing we need to understand and remember is that one single policy can't solve the problem. The problem is evolving on a daily basis and changing format, shape, and size, and therefore we do need to use a bouquet of policies that would be complementing each other. Samira referred to, for example, policies in food environment, and we need to try and link the different policies so that they strengthen each other and in the end help to improve the food environment in total. I do want to recommend that, for example, economic modeling and legal advice are two components that I think it's critical to have that support within your development of whichever policy you are working on. And then, of course, civil society support and engagement is critical and often requires quite a lot of input and I almost want to say capacity development, but in a way that they also understand the critical components and some of the nitty-gritty to support policies in general, because without civil society, none of the policies would have any traction and success in the end. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rina. Very concise but powerful ideas in economic modeling, support from legal advice and civil society engagement and sort of training and capacity development in a way. Thank you, Richmond. I saw you come online just a moment ago. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you very much. There's just two things I wanted to say in terms of food-based dietary guidelines for individuals to use, for the general population. That is one of the basic uses, but even more importantly, it serves as a policy guide for decision makers. In my earlier submission, I mentioned that it can be used across a wide variety of sectors: agriculture, trade, social protection, education, etc. And so what we have done beyond developing the very simple language guideline is also to develop something for policy makers and program implementers to use. And this is something that we have just come up with recently. We are just about to outdoor that and to disseminate that. But that is supposed to accompany the food-based dietary guidelines. And in this, each sector, we will find a list of actions and policy actions that each sector can take to be able to create an environment, an enabling environment for the food-based dietary guidelines to be successfully adhered to. The second thing I would like to say is that there's all kinds of capacity that has been developed around this in country, and we are excited that we can be able to share it with others. And I'm hoping that others who are also on this as part of FERNs, who are interested in implementing food-based dietary guidelines, we will be able to share that capacity with them. We have been able to do that successfully with the Gambia. And this week I received a message indicating that they are almost ready. I have the very final version of their document and reviewing that. And it's really exciting to see that a few more are coming up in the sub-region. So those were the things that I wanted to add. Brief, over to you.
Thanks very much, Richmond. I mean, this is great. I mean, the food-based dietary guidelines, not just as sort of an anchor and common foundation for food policy that can lead to better food environments, but also the idea of South-South or even intercontinental exchange, sharing, and mutual support. That's great. Habiba, we'll go next to you for your 3-minute comments, please.
Thank you. I'm going to speak maybe more generally, not on a specific subject. or a specific domain, because in order to advance food and nutrition security, and in all the research of our Institute of National Planning, it was found that for the country to advance, the situation or the standard of living and the quality of life of the rural population is very backwards, because it was neglected over half a century ago. Egypt was more interested in doing a lot of other priorities, and they neglected the rural areas, or the rural population. So we have now a mega project for improving the quality of life of Egyptians, with a whole list. It's a national policy with a whole list of improvement of living conditions, homes, access to clean water, sanitation, and everything is under the title of the project, which is called Decent Life. It's a national mega program, not a project. Another mega program is what is called the New Rural Egypt. So all of this are policies that support and enhance and accelerate the achievement of all the other policies. So it was not enough to say that I'm increasing agricultural production, but what is the life and the condition, or the living conditions and the life of the farmer? He didn't have electricity, he didn't have good roads, he didn't have clean water, and he didn't have communication. So access to communication, access to finance, access to basic infrastructure. These are, I think, general policies that have improved very much and supported and added more synergy to increase the outcome of all other policies. Now, if I talk about lessons learned, I'm sorry to be a little negative, but lessons learned may be contained in one sector. But what we are trying to do now is to open a transverse channels of communication and data sharing between the sectors, so that the lessons learned can benefit more than one sector. The old practice and the old tendency was to keep the information for yourself. In addition, that a culture of monitoring and evaluation was rather poorly developed. And what we're doing now is we're trying to improve and introduce the principles of monitoring and evaluation in all the government plans. If I think, what was your last question?
Yeah, it was about inclusivity.
The inclusiveness of policy and innovation, and leaving nobody behind. We're trying very hard, but access to the marginalized populations, we're trying to really reach them, outreach, but there are still a lot of people that are marginalized and underserved, and we're trying to overcome this. I'd like to maybe give an example of food policy.
Yeah, and if you could please conclude with that, please.
Yes, it is my last thing, that which was the result of evaluation and economic modeling, is that we give a lot of donations in kind. And there was a question, should we change and give cash transfer than in kind? And the research, which was done by IFPRI, said that with the fluctuation, the rapid fluctuation and increase in price of commodities, all the receivers and the beneficiaries said, no, we want in kind, because the kilogram of meat, we don't want to bear the difference. You bear the difference and not us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Those are great points. And one, the importance of this cross-sectoral learning and this siloing, right, of our common journey. And the other is that in this world of increasing food insecurity, I mean, that almost brings up a new dimension of food environment, right, which is just the element of food availability, especially for the most vulnerable. Ali, you get the last word in this final round of questions before we open up for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you. I think I will come back to this. I will start rather with what you last said about food insecurity. I think one of the lessons learned quite recently is about the fragility of our food systems, not only in Morocco or in Africa, but rather all around the world. And this fragility was very obvious during the COVID pandemic, where, you know, food choices were very limited. A lot of countries were faced with food insecurity, with the food shortages. If not food shortages, but the concern of this food shortage. Some other things, I think this has been highlighted by your esteemed guest, is that policy isn't always enforced. If we take the example of salt, we have a multitude of products on the market. How will we enforce salt reduction? And even if we come up with a policy, not an initiative, but rather a regulation and a policy of salt content, for example. I'm not going even to talk about sugar and fats, just salt or sodium in foods. How will we be able to assess thousands of food products each year, each day, and enforce these regulations? I think that the best approach would be to rather start small and gain momentum. I mean, food regulation shouldn't be like a witch hunt, because there is a lot of blame to go around. Nobody is the enemy of anybody, and we should collaborate in that sense. I think one from the modest experience that we had in this matter of reducing salt. In Morocco, the champion of salt reduction was a grassroots stakeholder, which is the Federation of Bakeries, the National Federation of Bakeries, who they were lobbied by a single professor of human nutrition. He approached the head of the federation and convinced him about the importance of salt reduction, and bread was used as a vector for this reduction. 10 years later, we did our studies, our analysis, found that there was a substantial reduction of sodium content, added sodium content in white bread. Now, the assessment of its effect on public health remains to be seen, because this takes a lot of effort to do. The initiative was a little bit halted by the years of COVID, but the future will tell.
Thanks so much, Ali. Great points, especially on this.
Sorry, we lost your voice. We lost.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks. Sorry, my bad. So yeah, thank you, Ali. Great points on the fragility of food systems, as well as the importance of enforcement, monitoring, evaluation of these policies, which are not a panacea, but are very critical towards progress. Great. So let's open up for questions and answers from all the participants. Please use the raised hand here on Zoom to indicate your question. Let's please keep questions brief so we allow time for the answers. We have no more than 5 to 10 minutes for this. Alternatively, feel free to type in your question in the chat. We can also take questions that way. So open floor for questions. If not, I can, just to get things going, throw a question. Anyone from the panel is welcome to address. I think we all agree how difficult behavior change in consumers is, right, towards healthier consumption patterns and diets. Why is it that the school environment is still such an underutilized lever for change, given that there is evidence that habits acquired during school life carry over to adult life anywhere between 35 to 50% in terms of those behaviors continuing on into adult life? Would any one of our panelists have any thoughts on that? And then we'll go to Rose. Rina?
Maybe if I could take a stab at it. That's why I said one policy can't achieve it. I think we need a bouquet of policies, and they need to speak to each other. The schools, they fall into a different directorate, and within government resources, that's often part of the reason why you don't have a seamless transition, but it's definitely a critical area, and one that I think we are working on in South Africa, where the one like the front of pack labeling will be used as your guideline as to what would be allowed, not allowed in terms of access to the schools and marketing to children. It is absolutely critical that we include that component.
Thank you, Rina. Rose, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you to all the presenters. I have listened to the presentations with keen interest. And one of the impressions that I got, and also from many other presentations, is if we attack the food industry somehow, we attack the food industry, we blame them for a lot of things that are happening. But many times when we are having these discussions, we don't involve them. And I don't think we can also do without the food industry. So what is the way forward? We cannot be talking only to ourselves when the food industry is not part of the discussions. So I would like to see, so I want suggestions from you, the way forward. How can we improve so that the food industry will be involved and also, share their views? Together, we come up with a better solution. Thank you.
Thank you, Rose. I was actually going to say that provocative questions are particularly welcome. So this is definitely a good and provocative question. Would any of our panelists like to take that on? Ali, I see you turning on your video.
Thank you. Yes, please. Thank you, Rose, for your remark. And that's why I said earlier in my last meeting that food policy shouldn't be, or food behavioral change, or all this these things we're talking about shouldn't be about blaming each other. It shouldn't be about finding someone to blame. It shouldn't be a witch hunt. Food industry is not an opponent. A lot of industries are grassroots. They are not multinationals, at least not in most African countries. And the good thing, the beautiful thing is when we sit down and talk, we are all trying to find a solution. Now, I've given the example of the bread industry. When we approached them, they didn't turn us around because it's a national problem. High blood pressure in Morocco is between 20 to 25% of the population. People from these industries are concerned also about this problem. So when we include them in the conversation, maybe not in in this conference, maybe it hasn't been done. But when we have these discussions about developing policies, sometimes not even policies, but just strategies on how we should address these problems, a lot of the time there is a collaboration that is built, and this is how it should be. Otherwise, it's doomed to failure.
Excellent, thank you. Any other questions, or would anybody like to also offer an answer to Rose's question?
Yeah, may I also weigh in?
Please go ahead, and then we'll also hear from Gershom. Please go ahead, Gershom.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very sure, Rose, you asked this question being aware of the fact that conflict of interest is always something that we have to deal with. And so perhaps instead of looking at it as why are they not being involved in the conversation, I think we need to be asking what would be the appropriate way in which we engage them. Obviously, it's not in every aspect of the conversation that they can be involved in. Example, when you are developing policies, they may not be necessarily directly involved in that, but you might want to study, for those of us who are in research, we want to study what is the role of food industry, in what ways have they responded, so we can learn from their response and to be able to develop better bridges so that they can be involved. We never forget the fact that there is a duty for those of us who are in food and nutrition and public health. We have a duty for protection of the population. The food industry has a duty for their bottom line, and we need to find a way where there will be win-wins, and it's not easy. In many countries, there are examples of how that kind of engagement has gone so bad. So I just want to point out that it's important to remember that, so that when we are thinking of engagement, we make.
Thank you, Richmond. Gershom, I'll ask you just to be concise in your answer. Please go ahead.
Yes, my point is closely related to what Richmond has mentioned. It's important to say what level of involvement and at what stage. We have experienced this in Kenya. The law in Kenya demands that when you're developing policies or implementing policies, you should there should be public participation that includes the industry. So one example I'll give you is that the industry was involved in conversations about thresholds in the nutrient profile model with that in mind, the public participation in mind. However, they actually attempted to influence the thresholds to values that were not favorable. So we have now put it a point. All the policy formulation committees have signed a conflict of interest form not to engage with industry. And we're also defining when industry should be involved. Indeed, if it comes to implementation of the front of pack level, industry has to be there. But when you're talking about the technical content of this standard, maybe it's not the right place to involve the industry. So I think the point is, yes, it's good to involve industry, but then it's important to define well when to involve the industry. Thank you.
Thank you, great point. So thoughtful and qualified engagement of industry, but as Ali said, without sort of a Manichaean view or demonizing parties. I mean, everybody ultimately has to be at the table, albeit in a thoughtful way, because there are vested interests at play as well. Let me see if there is another question here in the chat. It's just a comment. Last call for any questions. Anyone from the participants? Okay, going one, going twice, going thrice. So I really want to thank very much all the panelists for their great contributions, as well as everybody who joined us for this session. Food environments are the one subsystem within the food system that touches absolutely everyone and everybody. We live in an increasingly complex world, which makes the effort to develop food environment policies, likewise more complex. As Rina mentioned, I mean, this is a complex and adaptive system that we're dealing with. But we do have quite a few very exciting innovations. Some countries, of course, have greater policy capacity than others, and we can all learn from each other. And in the end, we really have to be inclusive in our approach to food environments, and as much as possible, share these innovations, bring them to local context, generate the evidence, and do it in an inclusive manner towards the food environment that we all aspire to. So thanks everyone again. We now have a 15-minute break until the next session. Silver, I'm going to turn it over to you before then we go into the break. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the time. Just to let you know that the next session is going to be moderated by Professor Peter Delabo, and he's here with us. So we'll break quickly and then we come back. And it's going to be also a very exciting conversation where we showcase work going on around the entire continent to improve food environment. It could be policy, research, practice. So stick around and enjoy the session. Thank you.